You're watching Act TV. I'm Juliana Forlano. Last week, the New York State Senate voted to repeal a provision known as 50A, which shielded police officers' disciplinary records from the public. It was on the books for over 40 years, and its repeal presents clear evidence that nationwide protest has the power to make real change. Here to talk about the significance of the repeal of 50A is New York State Senator Julia Salazar. Julia, welcome. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You represent New York's 18th State Senate District. Can you talk a little bit about your district and how 50A has affected people in your district?
Absolutely. My district is in North Brooklyn, includes the neighborhoods of East New York, Cypress Hills, Bushwick, Williamsburg, part of Greenpoint, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville. It is a majority Black and Brown district. About 70% or more of the district is Black and Latino. And so, as we all know, people of color have been discriminated against in law enforcement, and more likely to be targeted by police brutality. So repealing Section 50A of the Civil Rights Law in New York has particular significance for communities like those that I live in and represent. As you mentioned, the law had been on the books for a long time, and it had been used time and time again in cases where officers committed violence against civilians. Section 50A had been used to shield those same officers from accountability, and then additionally shielded more officers that we don't even know about, that didn't receive as much attention, shielded them from accountability as well. And so finally repealing this is a victory for everyone who has had interactions with the police that constitute misconduct or worse, for the families who have even lost loved ones who were killed by officers.
President Patrick Lynch of the New York City Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, one of the most powerful unions in the state, his response was, and I quote, "The council," meaning the city council, "has simply ignored the serious risks to police officer safety, the reputational harm of publishing false allegations, which will unfairly impact the careers of good police officers to keep all New Yorkers safe in favor of purported," and then he does quotes, "criminal justice reform." Your response to Patrick Lynch?
Well, I'm not surprised that that's the PBA's position. The police union's going to do what the police union operates to do, right? But we know that 50A in a national context was one of the most secretive laws on the books, that compared to other states, New York State has really been behind when it comes to transparency and accountability in law enforcement and for public officials in general. So, and what we know about other states that don't have an equivalent law that shields people from accountability is that you're not seeing officers being targeted by violence or being put in danger as a result. In most cases, in most places where you would have seen someone like Officer Pantaleo kill Eric Garner on video, if that had happened in most other states, we would have known the disciplinary record of the officer without it being leaked years later. And that's just one example. There are, I used to sit with families in meetings with the mayor and the police commissioner in which they would beg just to have basic information about the officers who killed their family member. And it was always, 50A was always cited in withholding that information from them. We know that this is not going to endanger the safety of officers, and that this is just, it's better for public safety. It's better in our efforts to prevent officers who commit violence from remaining on the force. So
we have seen, times where people attack the police, and it does, physically, and it seems like this would help that if it's transparent, so that the police that are on the force are, following the laws, they have a reason to follow the laws. regardless of how you feel about policing in general, that this would actually protect those police, because arguably you would know if there was a bad apple. I don't want to get in necessarily to the bad apple discussion, but um, it seems like this would actually be protective of police.
Right. And regardless of your position on the bad apples and good apples discussion, as you said, this has the potential to also improve trust between communities and the police, in which the local precinct and the local officers are generally actually motivated by public safety and generally working with the community. Now that we know that there will be increased transparency and accountability, there's more reason for people to feel safe around the police. It isn't, of course, it isn't everything. There's much more that still needs to be done, and I definitely support the calls to reduce the NYPD budget significantly. But regardless, this is a step toward public safety, not only for civilians, but also for officers and for public servants.
Julia, we just covered a story about how certain localities, including Denver, are removing the police from our schools. Do we have any movement on that here in New York City?
It's unclear if if the budget negotiations in the city council, and if discussions in the council about police accountability and responding to recent direct action, right? That's really what motivated the changes, the package of police reforms that we passed last week in the state legislature, including the repeal of 50A. It was truly a response to the protests and the direct actions. And so everyone who's participated in that direct action should be proud of that. It really demonstrated that direct action gets the goods, right? But it's unclear right now if that's on the table at the city level in New York, to end contracts between officers and the Department of Education. But certainly there have been calls for that for a long time, a campaign known often as Counselors Not Cops, to invest in counselors in our public schools, because there are woefully few counselors in our schools, and yet most of our public schools, especially in neighborhoods such as the ones that I represent, there are too many officers, and it makes students feel criminalized when they're just trying to go to school every day.
I gotta say, I was a little more disappointed in Governor Cuomo the other day when he's like, okay, well, protesters, you won. Now tell us what you want. I'm like, we've been telling you what we want. What happened? Are you not adjust your,
Yeah, it's like maybe we are telling you what we want, but you don't want to hear it. But I think that the messages have actually been quite clear from people in the streets, that we want to see public safety really transformed. For Black Americans, they want the police to stop targeting them, right? We don't want to see another. I'm sure that people are tired. I was listening to a Black woman who had been involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and she said, the demands have changed a little bit, but not much. We really just want to be able to walk with confidence in our own neighborhoods and know that we're not going to be subjected to violence. So that's a pretty clear demand, and there are a lot of policies that can be implemented in order to make it a reality.
So we're hearing about them, different localities, including New York, removing some of the budget from the police department. It seems like it's a bit of a pittance here in New York. We could do better for sure. Perhaps removing some of or perhaps stopping the contracts with the schools and repealing 50A. What's next on the agenda in terms of addressing police brutality and racial injustice in New York?
Well, one bill at the state level that wasn't passed and wasn't really on the agenda was something known as unnecessary arrests. There's legislation that Senator Bailey introduced. It was supported by the same large coalition of advocates for police accountability. And what it would do is minimize, in the first place, the number of unnecessary encounters that civilians are having with the police in cases where officers currently have a choice of whether to issue a summons or make an actual arrest. They would be required to issue a summons. And these are low-level nonviolent offenses, things like smoking a small amount of weed, or even like riding your bike on the sidewalk, things that in white neighborhoods, people don't even know these are violations or crimes. But in heavily policed neighborhoods of color, we know that due to the practice of broken windows policing, people are still being arrested and then ending up in the system in the first place for these silly minor infractions. So that's something that we continue to fight for at the state level. And at the city level, we're at this critical moment. We're now seeing council members committing to vote no on the city budget if it doesn't include a significant reduction. People are saying $1 billion at least in reduced funds to the NYPD, which is given typically nearly $6 billion per year by the city. And so we're finally talking about taking the resources that we see our police department misusing and transferring them to community-based alternatives and community-based solutions to public safety. So that really is the big fight right now. I only wish that I would get to vote on that, but I'm really excited to see it happening at the city level and see the popular support for it.
We're speaking to New York State Senator Julia Salazar. If you are in the progressive movement, you know that Julia Salazar is one of our heroes here in New York. And I don't want to lionize you and put you on a pedestal, but you know you're already up there. So I think that's, it's a plus. I have people coming in to our stream chat here on Twitch, and their responses are, the reforms from Kesbox, the reforms are something, but not enough. Is there not enough evidence yet that police forces as they work right now don't work, that the entire institution is broken? A police officer that steps forward and calls out violence of their colleague, they're either fired or bullied out. How are so many people still assuming reforms are enough? Your thoughts?
I think that many people want to believe that reforms are enough, that the reforms that have already been made, such as increasing sensitivity training or training officers in doing mental health first aid, something that police officers really shouldn't be the first responders on in the first place. People want to believe that these reforms will work because so many people, including people in the communities I represent, including people of color, take some comfort and safety from being able to call the police. Sometimes it's cyclical, right? In neighborhoods where we have experienced more violence and there isn't an alternative, or at least, we can envision an alternative, but really we've had to rely on the police in order to keep us safe or to give us even an illusion of safety. People want to continue to believe that at least fundamentally the police will keep them safe. And that's why this is a critical moment for us to see an awakening and facilitate that awakening in the discourse about what is public safety and how do we keep our communities safe. So I certainly agree that reform is not enough, and I'm hopeful that people are seeing that more and more, that we really need to divest and invest in our communities.
It certainly seems like 50A is the most important piece of this, because if we're going to still have policing, to have the transparency that is needed by the community so that they can, as you said earlier, trust the guy who's actually there, the physical human being who's actually there. And then wouldn't this provide some, so there's transparency, but then how would this translate to being able to keep them accountable, to force out officers who have a history of, horrendous behavior or not following rules or whatever you want to call it?
Well, if we look at the case of Officer Pantaleo, who killed Eric Garner, Officer Pantaleo, we only know this, of course, because his disciplinary records were leaked because 50A shielded him from accountability. But we now know that Officer Pantaleo had a particularly egregious disciplinary record before he used a chokehold and killed Eric Garner. Officer Pantaleo had been accused of excessive force before, of misconduct before. So if the very first time that an officer, such as Officer Pantaleo, is accused of misconduct or has an inappropriate encounter with a civilian, if that person is able to see their disciplinary record, or file a complaint, so that going forward, that is a publicly accessible information, then you not only have the NYPD holding the NYPD accountable, which has been the standard that naturally doesn't work, but now you finally have the public holding the NYPD accountable. So it's particularly meaningful for families who have lost loved ones to police brutality, but it's really meaningful for all New Yorkers who care about, at minimum, making sure that there aren't officers in the NYPD who are committing violence against people.
How can our audience, this is ACT TV, and we always encourage people to do more than watch when it comes to TV. How can our audience plug into these efforts that are being made here?
Well, the coalition that I really give the credit to for passing these policies at the state level and for amplifying the fight at the city level to defund the NYPD is the Communities United for Police Reform Coalition. It includes a bunch of grassroots organizations led by Black and Brown New Yorkers and people who are directly impacted by police violence and over policing in our communities. I would really encourage everyone to get involved in that coalition by just going to changethenYPD.org. Also, if there is a policy on the table that you care about, call your representative. We received more in the state legislature, more calls to repeal 50A and more emails to repeal 50A than we received on any other issue in the past 2 years that I've been in office. And that says a lot, because we, naturally, thankfully, people are reaching out to us every day to advocate for themselves. But that's really the most important thing that you can do. And if you're ever unsure where to begin, you can always call my district office or legislative office as well. We're here to help, help people become more civically engaged.
We're speaking with Julia Salazar, New York State Senator from Brooklyn. What's next in your policy fight as you move on? We're about to have Steve Horn from the Real News Network come on to talk about the intersection of the environment and racism. Any movement on environmentalism from your district?
In my district, it's sort of a hyper-local fight, but it has huge ramifications. National Grid has been seeking to expand a fracked gas pipeline right through my district in Bushwick and Williamsburg, right? And we meaning Stain Energy Project and DSA Eco Socialist advocates on the ground were successful in getting them to halt the construction, but they recently resumed construction on this pipeline. The last thing that we need right now in New York, where we passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act last year, it was landmark climate justice legislation. The last thing we need to be doing is expanding fossil fuel infrastructure and gas infrastructure. So we're going to continue.
Which pipeline is this? I thought Governor Cuomo put the kibosh on the major one that they were trying to do recently.
Right, the Williams pipeline. Yeah, and that was a huge win for environmental justice advocates as well. But this pipeline is actually an extension of a currently existing pipeline. And so right now it's just in Brooklyn, but in the final phases, it would expand to other parts of the city. And so it's really important that we stop that in its tracks. We know we don't need to be expanding gas infrastructure, and it's just going to become a stranded asset when we transition to 100% renewable energy, which is what what we as a state have established as a clear goal.
I don't
So
understand how they could say, even in a safety level, like these pipelines are known to explode. I remember watching them drop pipeline under Flatbush Avenue. You know, in the under the cover of night at midnight, they would start dropping Flatbush Avenue, one of the most crowded roads in the entire United States. They're dropping an exploding pipeline. It seems like, are there no safety controls in the city that we could just say, well, infrastructure, this is not safe to the people who live here?
yeah, unfortunately, the regulations are insufficient to stop the construction on that basis alone. So we have to continue to fight to stop it on the basis of the longer term, not so long, to be honest, but the longer term impacts on the environment, and demanding answers to the questions of why our communities, why on Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn, why through Bushwick and Bed-Stuy, why are our communities having to bear the brunt of the danger of a potentially explosive pipeline? Like you said, why are our communities having to deal with the negative environmental impacts of the use of fossil fuels? We shouldn't have to anymore, and our communities need to be prioritized in a just transition completely off of fossil fuel use.
We've been speaking with Senator Julia Salazar, who represents New York's 18th State Senate District, including the Brooklyn neighborhoods of Bushwick, Cypress Hills, Greenpoint, Williamsburg, parts of Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, and East New York. You have a big, wide group of people you're advocating for. So thank you for the work that you are doing. You in 2018, you were the youngest woman elected in the history of the New York State Senate. You're also an avowed progressive. You can follow Julia on Twitter at Salazar Senate, Salazar Senate. Julia, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, as always. Stay safe.
You too. Thank you so much.